God is dead. These three words, penned by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, have echoed through the corridors of intellectual history, sparking controversy and igniting debate for over a century. Nietzsche's proclamation wasn't just a bold statement, it was a profound challenge to the very fabric of Western thought. Calma. Não é o que você pensa. Nietzsche wasn't declaring a literal death of a deity. Instead, he was pointing to a seismic shift in the collective consciousness of society. His pronouncement was far more profound, a philosophical earthquake that continues to shake the foundations of Western civilization. It was a call to recognize the deep changes happening beneath the surface. Nietzsche's declaration of God's death was a radical diagnosis of the spiritual crisis of his time, a crisis that he believed was not just a passing phase, but a fundamental transformation. A crisis he believed was engulfing the entirety of Western civilization. This crisis was characterized by a loss of meaning and direction, as traditional values and beliefs were being questioned and dismantled. He argued that the Enlightenment, for all its emphasis on reason and progress, had inadvertently pulled the rug out from under its own feet. The very principles that had driven humanity forward were now leading to its existential despair. By dethroning God and embracing a purely materialistic worldview, humanity had rendered its most cherished values meaningless. The moral compass that had guided societies for centuries was now adrift. Nietzsche's critique was not aimed at religion per se, but at the underlying value system that had propped up Western civilization for centuries. He saw the need for a new foundation, but at the underlying value system that had propped up Western civilization for centuries. This system, Nietzsche argued, was no longer viable in the modern world. He saw this system, with its emphasis on self-denial, humility, and compassion, as a form of life-denying weakness. Nietzsche believed that these values stifled human potential and creativity. In its place, he called for a radical revaluation of all values, a complete overhaul of the moral and philosophical landscape, one that would embrace the fullness of human existence, with all its joys, sorrows, and contradictions. Nietzsche envisioned a world where individuals could create their own values and live authentically. For Nietzsche, the death of God was not a cause for celebration, but a profound loss, a gaping abyss at the heart of Western culture. With the traditional foundations of morality crumbling, he saw a world teetering on the brink of chaos and nihilism, a state of utter meaninglessness and despair. The implications of this spiritual vacuum were, for Nietzsche, nothing short of terrifying. He believed that, without a transcendent source of value, humanity would be left adrift in a sea of relativism, where everything is permitted and nothing has intrinsic worth. In such a world, the very possibility of meaning, purpose, and morality would be called into question. Moreover, Nietzsche argued that this vacuum would not remain empty for long. New idols, new dogmas, and new forms of tyranny would inevitably emerge to fill the void left by God. These new ideologies, he feared, would be even more dangerous than the old, for they would lack even the pretense of divine authority. Nihilism for Nietzsche was not a philosophical position to be argued for, but a cultural pathology, a sickness unto death. It was the terrifying realization that the universe is indifferent to our hopes and dreams, that our existence is but a fleeting moment in the grand cosmic drama, and that ultimately, our lives amount to nothing. Nietzsche saw nihilism as the inevitable consequence of the Enlightenment's rejection of traditional values. By dismantling the metaphysical scaffolding that had once given meaning and purpose to human life, he believed the Enlightenment had inadvertently unleashed a corrosive force that threatened to undermine the very foundations of Western civilization. The danger of nihilism, according to Nietzsche, is that it leads to a paralysis of the will. If life is ultimately meaningless, then what is the point of striving, creating, or aspiring to greatness? Why bother with morality, art, or philosophy if all our efforts are destined to be swallowed up by the abyss of time? Section 4. The Will to Power as a Guiding Principle. Despite the bleakness of his diagnosis, Nietzsche was not a prophet of despair. He believed that the death of God, while a traumatic event, also presented humanity with a unique opportunity, the chance to create new values, to forge a new path for itself, based not on divine commandment, but on the affirmation of life in all its fullness. At the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy lies the concept of the will to power, which he saw as the fundamental driving force of all living things. This will to power is not simply a desire for dominance over others, but a striving for growth, self-overcoming, and the realization of one's full potential. For Nietzsche, the will to power was not something to be feared or suppressed, but rather embraced and channeled into creative and life-affirming pursuits. It was the driving force behind all great art, philosophy, and cultural achievement, the engine of human creativity and self-transcendence. Section 5. Master morality versus slave morality. Nietzsche contrasted the will to power with what he called the will to nothingness, a life-denying impulse that he saw embodied in traditional morality, particularly in the Judeo-Christian tradition. This will to nothingness, according to Nietzsche, was a force that sought to suppress the natural instincts and desires of individuals, promoting a kind of spiritual stagnation. He argued that this morality, with its emphasis on humility, self-sacrifice, and compassion for the weak, was a form of spiritual revenge enacted by the weak against the strong. In Nietzsche's view, these values were not inherently virtuous, but were instead a means for the powerless to assert control over the powerful by promoting a moral framework that favored their own interests. He labeled this traditional morality slave morality, contrasting it with the master morality of the ancient Greeks, which he saw as life-affirming and characterized by a love of excellence, nobility, and a striving for greatness. The ancient Greeks, in Nietzsche's eyes, celebrated human potential and the pursuit of personal excellence, viewing life as an arena for achieving greatness and expressing one's true nature. Master morality, according to Nietzsche, was not concerned with good and evil in the traditional sense, but with what was beneficial or harmful to the flourishing of life itself. It was a morality that embraced strength, power, and the full expression of one's abilities, seeing these qualities as essential to the vitality and progress of humanity. Nietzsche's critique of slave morality was not an endorsement of cruelty or exploitation. Instead, he sought to challenge the prevailing moral values of his time, encouraging individuals to question the origins and implications of their moral beliefs. Rather, it was a call for a revaluation of values, a shift away from a morality based on guilt and resentment towards one grounded in the affirmation of life, strength, and individual excellence. Nietzsche envisioned a future where individuals could transcend the limitations imposed by traditional moral systems and embrace a more dynamic and life-affirming approach to ethics. Section 6. The Revaluation of All Values. The death of God, for Nietzsche, signaled the need for a radical re-evaluation of all values. This was not merely a philosophical statement, but a profound cultural shift. Nietzsche saw the decline of religious authority as an opportunity for humanity to redefine its moral compass. He believed that the old moral codes, no longer grounded in divine authority, had lost their binding power. Without the divine to dictate what is right and wrong, humanity was left in a moral vacuum, a void that needed to be filled with new values. Humanity was thus faced with a daunting but exhilarating task to create its own values, to determine for itself what is right and wrong, good and bad, noble and base. This was not a simple task, but a profound responsibility that required deep introspection and courage. This revaluation of all values was not a call to anarchy or moral relativism. Nietzsche was not advocating for a world where anything goes, but rather for a world where values are consciously chosen and rigorously tested. Nietzsche believed that some values were objectively better than others, insofar as they promoted human flourishing and the realization of our highest potentials. He saw the potential for a new kind of greatness in humanity, one that was self-determined and self-affirmed. However, he insisted that these values could not be discovered through reason alone, but rather through a process of experimentation, self-discovery, and creative engagement with the world. It was through living, creating, and experiencing that one could find and affirm these new values. The revaluation of all values was an ongoing project, a task that each individual and each generation would have to undertake anew. It was a dynamic process, ever evolving and never complete, reflecting the changing nature of human existence. It was a call to embrace the full burden of freedom and responsibility in a world without God. Nietzsche's vision was one of empowerment, urging humanity to rise to the challenge of creating a meaningful life through its own efforts and ingenuity.